The first snowflakes of the season were a lie, soft, deceiving, like a sweet promise from a known liar. But Rosamond Vance, she knew the truth of it. She knew how that gentle dusting would gather into a thick, suffocating shroud. How the wind would soon sharpen each flake into a tiny blade of ice. How this beautiful, treacherous white could bury a man so deep that the spring thaw would find only clean-picked bones. That's why the crimson stain was so wrong. It blossomed against the fresh snow like a brutal, impossible flower. A splash of violence in a world that was supposed to be going to sleep for the winter. It was a trail that led her to him. He was face down, a broken warrior in a sea of white, his life pumping out into the snow with every shallow, hitching breath. To help him, that was to invite death himself to ride double on her horse. To leave him, that was to let the wilderness carve out the last soft piece of her soul and leave her as empty as a winter sky. She stood there, the wind tearing at her, the blood steaming in the cold. She made her choice. She just had no idea it was the choice that would set the entire territory on fire. The wind bit with the teeth of a cornered wolf. It was a relentless assault, finding every tiny seam in Rosamond's worn buckskins, a high, lonesome sound that scoured the granite peaks of the grizzly's tooth range. It carried the scent of pine, of the coming deep winter, and something else, something coppery and primal. Blood. Her horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Flint, shifted nervously beneath her. His ears twitched, his nostrils flared, testing the air. Rosa reined him in, her eyes the color of a stormy sky, scanning the snow-dusted landscape. She was a woman, carved from the wilderness itself. Her face was a map of sun and wind, her hands calloused from setting traps and dressing hides. She'd come to these mountains 5 years ago, running from the ghosts of a different life back east, a life of suffocating parlors, tight-laced dresses, and promises that turned to dust in your mouth. Here, survival was an honest, brutal transaction. You paid your dues in sweat, in vigilance, in solitude. And the mountains, in their cold, indifferent way, paid you back with another day's breath. The scent was stronger now. It wasn't the scent of a deer brought down by a cougar. This was heavier, more human. Flint snorted, a plume of white vapor erupting from his nostrils like a warning. Against her better judgment, against every single instinct for self-preservation she had honed to a razor's edge, Rosa nudged him forward. She unslung the Winchester from its saddle scabbard. The cold steel was a familiar, comforting weight in her hands. Trouble in these parts usually came on two legs, and it rarely offered a polite introduction before it tried to kill you. She followed the scent into a forest that had gone unnervingly still. The usual chatter of squirrels had ceased. No birds called from the snow-laden branches. It was a silence of reverence, or maybe of fear. Then she saw it. It wasn't a trail of footprints. It was the trail of a body being dragged. A smear of dark red painted a grim path through the thin layer of snow, ending near a thicket of frost-covered aspens. Dismounting, Rosa moved with a hunter's silence, her rifle held at a low ready, her boots making no sound on the forest floor. The air grew thick with the smell of blood and wet, cold earth. Behind the aspens, half buried in a drift, lay a man. He was native. That much was clear from his dark, braided hair and the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, one of which was missing, his bare foot already turning a deathly blue. He was dressed for the high country in leather and furs, but his tunic was torn open, revealing a gruesome wound in his side. A ragged, deep gash that looked like it had been made by a broken spearhead or a knife in a desperate, ugly struggle. His chest rose and fell in shallow, hitching breaths. He was young, his features strong and angular, even when slack with approaching death. A handsome face, now pale and etched with a pain so deep it seemed to have carved itself into his bones. Rosa's first instinct was cold and practical. "Turn around, get on your horse, ride away. This is not your fight." He was likely from one of the tribes that kept a weary, hostile distance from settlements like Whispering Creek, a people who settled their own scores and settled them harshly. Getting involved was a fool's errand. It was an open invitation for his enemies to become hers, or worse, for his own people to find her standing over him and mistake her for one of them. She'd seen what happened to outsiders who meddled in tribal affairs. It was never clean, it was never simple, and it usually ended in more blood soaking into the ground. She stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of her brown hair across her face, the cold seeping into her bones. The man groaned. It was a low, guttural sound of pure agony that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground and right up into her soul. His eyes fluttered open for a second, unfocused, glazed with pain, before shutting again. But in that fleeting moment, she saw not a warrior, not a stranger, not a threat. She just saw a man, dying alone in the unforgiving cold. Something inside her, a stubborn, buried ember of the woman she used to be, flared to life. She cursed herself for it, a low, bitter sound swallowed by the wind. Solitude had made her hard, but it hadn't yet made her cruel. She couldn't leave him. She couldn't be the kind of person who listened to a man's dying breath and simply rode on. With a sigh of pure resignation, a sigh that tasted like trouble, she knelt beside him, laying her rifle carefully in the snow. Her touch was professional, her hands moving with a practiced economy as she assessed the damage. The wound was deep, dangerously deep. He was losing too much blood. The cold was the only thing keeping him alive, slowing the flow, but it was also killing him, seeping into his bones, draining the life from him with icy, relentless fingers. Hypothermia. He was burning and freezing at the same time, his skin clammy and dangerously cold to the touch. "All right, let's see what we're working with," she murmured, more to herself than to the unconscious man. He was heavy, a dead weight of solid muscle and bone. Just getting him on Flint's back would be a monumental task. She searched his person, not for valuables, but for anything that might identify him or his assailants. She found nothing. No weapons, no pouch, no personal tokens. He had been stripped of everything. This wasn't a random fight. It was an execution, a sloppy, arrogant one. They had left him for the cold and the scavengers to finish the job. She ripped a long strip from her own spare blanket in her saddlebag, her mind already working, calculating the odds, and not liking them one bit. She packed the wound as best she could, trying to stanch the bleeding. The man flinched, a hiss of pain escaping his lips, but he didn't have the strength to fight her. "Easy now," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm not going to hurt you, not more than you already are anyway." It took the better part of an hour, a grueling, muscle-straining effort that left her gasping in the thin, cold air, to haul him from the ground and drape him over Flint's saddle. The horse protested, sidestepping and rolling his eyes at the unfamiliar scent and the dead weight of the bleeding man. But Rose's firm hand and calming words eventually settled him. She tied the warrior's wrists loosely to the saddle horn to keep him from sliding off, her own fingers growing numb and clumsy from the cold. As she secured the final knot, his head lolled to the side. A small, intricately carved wooden bird, attached to a leather thong, fell from inside his torn tunic and dangled against his chest. It was a hawk, its wings spread in flight, its tiny polished eyes seemingly staring right at her. It was the only personal effect he had left. For some reason, his attackers had missed it. Or maybe they hadn't dared to touch it. She took one last look at the blood-soaked snow, then at the vast, indifferent mountains surrounding them. She had just dragged a world of unknown danger into her solitary existence. This man had enemies. vicious ones. And now they might be hers too. Taking the reins, she began the slow, arduous trek back towards her isolated cabin, the unconscious weight of the stranger a heavy burden on her horse and a far heavier one on her future. She was carrying a dying warrior through the frozen wilds, a man without a name, without a past she could understand, completely unaware that he was not just any warrior. He was the heir to a legacy of power and blood she could never have imagined. And the men who wanted him dead were not the kind to give up. The journey back to her cabin was a slow-motion nightmare. Every careful step Flint took seemed to jostle the wounded man, drawing faint, pain-filled moans that were quickly snatched away by the howling wind. Rosa walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other often resting on the stranger's leg, steadying him, as if her touch alone could hold him together. The sky had turned a bruised, angry purple, and the snow was falling in earnest now, thick, wet flakes that clung to her eyelashes and melted on the man's feverish skin. Her cabin was little more than a one-room shelter, built cunningly into the side of a hill and shielded by a stand of ancient pines. It was her fortress, the one place in this entire unforgiving world where she felt secure. Bringing him here felt like a violation of that sacred solitude, a crack in the armor she had so carefully constructed around herself for 5 long years. Inside, the air was cold and still. With movements born of desperation and a surprising reserve of strength, she managed to slide the man off the horse and drag him inside, laying him on the thick bearskin rug near the stone hearth. She tended to the exhausted Flint quickly, stabling him in the small lean-to and giving him a precious ration of oats before returning to her unwilling patient. She lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the encroaching darkness and revealing the grim, bloody reality of her situation. The man's face was ashen, his lips tinged with blue. His breathing was a ragged, terrifying whisper. Rosa worked with a frantic, focused energy. She stoked the fire, piling on logs until it roared to life, casting huge, dancing shadows on the log walls that looked like warring giants. She stripped off his cold, wet clothes, her movements brisk and impersonal, trying not to notice the sheer power in his build. His body was a tapestry of old scars, a testament to a life of brutal conflict. But it was the fresh wound that commanded her complete attention. It was worse than she'd thought in the fading light of the forest. It was angry, inflamed, and smelled of infection. From a small wooden chest, her only link to her past life, she retrieved her medical supplies, a bottle of whiskey, clean rags, a needle, and gut thread. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. "This is going to hurt," she said to the unconscious man, her voice rough. "Probably more than anything you've ever felt. But if you want to see another sunrise, you'll have to bear it." She poured a little whiskey between his lips, hoping some of it would go down and dull the pain. Most of it just dribbled down his chin onto the bearskin. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she uncorked the bottle and poured the rest of the raw, burning liquid directly into the wound. The man's body arched off the floor with a strangled, inhuman scream that tore through the cabin. His eyes flew open, wide with shock and pure agony. But they weren't seeing her. They were seeing the blackness of unimaginable pain. He thrashed, his powerful limbs fighting against an unseen enemy, his muscles cording with fever-fueled strength. Rosa threw her body across his chest, using all of her weight to pin him down, her own muscles straining against his raw power. "Hold still! Damn you, hold still or you'll die!" she yelled, the words torn from her throat, her voice raw. The struggle felt like an eternity, a battle of wills in the firelight. Finally, his body went limp, his consciousness surrendering once more to the abyss. Shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, Rosa set to work. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of the torn flesh. Then, with the lantern pulled close, its light glinting off the needle, she began to stitch the ragged edges together. Her stitches were crude but strong, the kind you use to mend a saddle, not a man. She worked until her fingers were cramped and her eyes burned from the smoke and the intense concentration. When she was done, she bandaged him tightly, then covered him with every blanket she owned. She spent the rest of that long night sitting by the fire, her Winchester across her lap, listening to two sounds: the howl of the blizzard outside and the faint, stuttering breath of the stranger inside. Each breath was a victory. Each moment of silence was a terror. The next few days blurred into a grueling routine of survival and care. She hunted when the storm broke, taking a small buck that would have to feed them for a week. She melted snow for water, brewed bitter teas from willow bark to fight his raging fever, and forced spoonfuls of warm broth between his cracked lips. She cleaned and redressed his wound, fighting back the angry red lines of infection that threatened to claim him. He was delirious most of the time, trapped in a violent fever dream. He spoke, but not in English. The words were guttural, rhythmic, spilling from him in disjointed, urgent phrases. They were the words of his people, and to Rosa they were meaningless sounds, but the tone, the raw emotion in his voice, was what held her captive. Sometimes he spoke with a clear, sharp authority, as if commanding warriors on a battlefield. Other times his voice was filled with a deep, heartbreaking sorrow, and he would repeat a single name, Lyra, over and over, his voice breaking on the syllables. And sometimes he would cry out in a voice thick with rage, spitting another name like a curse, Corbin. Rosa found herself listening intently, piecing together the emotional fragments of a life she couldn't possibly understand. She learned the cadence of his voice, the texture of his pain. She saw the deep well of vulnerability beneath the warrior's scarred exterior. Without knowing his name, she began to know the man. She was watching a story unfold in a language she didn't speak, a story of love, betrayal, and a hatred so deep it burned through the fever. One afternoon, as she was carefully changing his dressing, his eyes opened. This time they were clear. They focused on her face, and for the first time, there was a sharp, assessing awareness in them. His gaze was intense, searching, not with fear, but with a deep, burning curiosity. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged from his throat. She held a cup of water to his lips. "Easy, don't try to talk." He drank greedily, then sank back, exhausted by the small effort. His eyes, a startlingly dark brown, never left hers. There was no fear in them, only a profound, weary questioning. Who was she? Where was he? "You're in my cabin," she answered his unspoken questions, her voice quiet. "In the grizzly's tooth. I found you 3 days ago. You were in a bad way." He closed his eyes, a flicker of memory, or perhaps just pain, crossing his features. He tried to lift a hand to touch the wound in his side, but he was too weak. "Who did this to you?" she asked gently, unable to stop herself. His lips formed a word, but no sound came out. He tried again, his brow furrowing with a deep, visible frustration. He coughed, a racking, painful sound that sent a fresh wave of agony through him. He pointed a trembling finger to his throat, then shook his head, a look of pure despair settling in his eyes. The effort of that terrible scream, when she had poured the whiskey into his wound, combined with the fever and dehydration, had seemingly stolen his voice. He was trapped, not only in a stranger's cabin in the middle of a frozen wilderness, but inside his own silent body. Rosa felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in years. Pity. "Rest," she said, her tone softer than she intended. "We'll figure it out. For now, just rest." But as she watched him drift back into an uneasy sleep, a cold realization washed over her. His silence wasn't just a complication, it was a death sentence. He couldn't tell her who he was. He couldn't tell her who was after him or why. She was nursing a man back to health, but she was also harboring a living, breathing secret. And out there, in that vast, snow-covered wilderness, she knew with a chilling certainty that the people who had left him for dead would not be content to assume the job was done. They would come looking. They would come to finish what they started. And she and her silent warrior were right in their path. A week crawled by, measured in the dwindling stack of firewood and the slow, agonizing return of the stranger's strength. He was still unable to speak above a raw, painful whisper, his vocal cords seemingly shredded by his ordeal. Communication became a slow, frustrating dance of gestures, nods, and drawings in the dirt on the floor. She learned his name was Kalen, a name he traced with a trembling finger in a patch of spilled flour on the table. He learned hers was Rosa. It was a fragile truce, a partnership born of absolute, desperate necessity. Kalen was a restless patient. The moment he could stand, leaning heavily on the wall for support, he began to push himself. He would watch her for hours, his dark eyes tracking her every move as she cleaned her rifle, sharpened her skinning knives, or stretched a fresh pelt. There was a fierce intelligence in his gaze, an analytical mind piecing together his surroundings, and more importantly, his rescuer. He pointed to her Winchester one day, then made a smooth gesture of aiming and firing. She nodded. He then pointed to himself and made a sharp, stabbing motion at his own side, his expression grim. He followed it by holding up 4 fingers, then making a motion of them surrounding one. 4 against 1. An ambush. The silent confirmation sent a shiver down Rosa's spine. This wasn't a fight that had gone wrong. It was a calculated assassination attempt. The name he'd uttered in his delirium came back to her, and she whispered it aloud, testing it. Corbin. Kalen's reaction was immediate and violent. His head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a cold, murderous fire. He nodded once, a sharp, angry jerk of his head. He then drew a finger slowly and deliberately across his own throat. An enemy, a deadly one. The fragile piece of the small cabin was shattered. The wilderness no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a hiding place with walls that were getting thinner by the minute. They had to move. Kalen, though still weak and favoring his side, seemed to understand this just as well as she did. His recovery became his singular focus. He forced himself to walk, first just circuits of the small cabin, then venturing outside, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he pushed through the pain. It was during one of these short, painful walks that their world came crashing down. They were near the edge of the clearing that surrounded her cabin when Flint, grazing nearby, suddenly went rigid. His head shot up, ears swiveling like antennae towards the east. Kalen heard it a second after the horse. He put a hand on Rosa's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He didn't need words. His entire body was a signal of pure alarm. Rosa strained her ears, listening past the constant sigh of the wind in the pines. Then she heard it too. The distant, rhythmic crunch of snow. It wasn't the sound of a deer or an elk. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple horses moving at a steady, deliberate pace. And they were coming closer. "Inside?" she hissed, her voice barely a whisper. "Now." They moved with a desperate, silent urgency. Kalen, despite his injury, scrambled back into the cabin with a speed that amazed her. Rosa grabbed Flint's reins and shoved him into the lean-to, praying he would remain quiet. She barred the heavy cabin door and extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into a semi-darkness, broken only by the dim gray light filtering through the single small window. She grabbed her Winchester, her knuckles white around the stock. Kaelin had found her largest skinning knife and stood flattened against the wall beside the door, his wounded side pressed against the cold logs. His face was a mask of grim determination. He was ready. They stood in absolute silence, their breaths held, as the sound of the horses grew louder and louder until it was right on top of them. The riders passed less than 100 yards from the cabin. Through a tiny crack in the window shutter, Rosa could see them. 4 riders, all native, dressed in heavy winter furs. They were armed to the teeth and moved with the deadly confidence of predators on a familiar trail. One of them, riding at the front, was powerfully built, his face harsh and impatient. Rosa felt a cold, sinking certainty that this was Corbin. One of the riders reined in his horse, pointing with a lance towards the ground. He had found the tracks she and Kaelin had made just moments before. The faint impressions in the snow, their fatal mistake. Rosa's heart leaped into her throat. They were caught. Corbin dismounted, his movements fluid and dangerous. He walked over to the tracks, kneeling for a moment. He then looked up, his gaze sweeping over the silent, hidden structure. He looked directly at the cabin. Rosa could feel his gaze like a physical touch, cold and probing. It felt as if he were looking right through the logs, right into her soul. Did he see the thin, pale wisp of smoke still curling from her chimney? Did he smell the lingering scent of wood smoke on the winter air? Time seemed to stop. The cabin was silent enough to hear a pin drop. Kaelin stood as still as a granite statue, the knife held low and ready. He was prepared to fight. He was prepared to die. But he was not prepared to be taken. For what felt like an eternity, Corbin stared at the cabin. Rosa held her breath, her finger tightening on the trigger of her rifle. She had built this life for herself, and she would defend it with her last breath. She would not be taken alive. Then, to her utter astonishment, Corbin shook his head. He said something to his men in their native tongue, the words sharp and dismissive. He gestured further down the canyon, as if the tracks were old, or perhaps from some lone trapper of no consequence. He seemed convinced his quarry was further ahead, that no one would be foolish enough to stop and make a camp so close to where the ambush had taken place. He was hunting a desperate fugitive, not a man being tended in a sick bed. His own arrogance was blinding him. He mounted his horse, and with a final dismissive glance at the silent woods around her cabin, he led his men away. Rosa and Kaelin remained frozen in place, listening until the sound of the horses faded completely, replaced once again by the lonely whisper of the wind. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, slumping against the wall, the rifle suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. Kaelin slid down the wall to sit on the floor, his head in his hands. His shoulders shook, not from fear, but from a potent, silent combination of rage and relief. They had been spared by a thread, by a single moment of arrogant assumption on Corbin's part. Rosa looked at him, seeing him clearly in that moment. He wasn't just a wounded man anymore. He was the most hunted man in the territory. And Corbin was not the kind of man who would give up. His chilling presence confirmed everything. The stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. Her small, isolated world had been breached. The danger she had invited in was now standing right beside her, holding a knife and bleeding on her floor. They had to run, not just from the mountains, but from the ghost who now wore Kaelin's face. Their next destination couldn't be another hiding place. It had to be the opposite. They needed civilization, a place with walls and people and noise, no matter how dangerous. They needed to get to Whispering Creek. Whispering Creek was a town that had mostly given up. It huddled in a windswept valley, a miserable collection of tired-looking buildings sagging under the weight of broken dreams and a permanent layer of grime. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, or a place they ended up when they had nowhere else to go. For Rosa and Kalen, it was a desperate, dangerous gamble. They arrived after 2 hard days of travel, avoiding the main trails, sticking to hidden game paths that Rosa knew by heart. Kalen rode Flint, bundled in Rosa's thickest blanket, while she walked ahead, her rifle in hand. He was still weak, the journey taking a heavy toll, but his silence was now one of grim resolve rather than helpless frustration. Entering the town's single muddy street felt like stepping onto a lit stage. Every eye seemed to turn towards them. Grimy prospectors, sullen-looking cowboys, and weary townsfolk paused to watch the woman in buckskins leading a horse that carried a wounded, grim-faced native warrior. It was a sight that screamed trouble from a mile away. Rosa kept her face impassive, her gaze sweeping over the dilapidated storefronts. A general store, a saloon whose bat-wing doors seemed to sigh with every gust of wind, and a livery stable. Her first priority was a doctor. She'd heard tell of an old physician in town, a man who had lost his practice in a bigger city and now patched up the drunks and accident victims of Whispering Creek for whiskey and coin. She found his shingle hanging crookedly outside a small clapboard house. Dr. Alistair Finch. Alistair was a stooped man with kind, watery eyes behind thick spectacles and hands permanently stained with ink and iodine. He looked at the formidable figure of Kalen leaning heavily in the doorway, then at Rosa's determined face, and simply sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Bring him in," he said, his voice raspy. "And try not to bleed on the good rug. It's the only one I have." While Alistair examined Kalen in the back room, his initial gruffness melting away into a quiet professionalism, Rosa waited in the front parlor. It was cluttered with books and strange medical curiosities in glass jars. The doctor returned half an hour later, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's a fighter, I'll give him that," Alistair said, sinking into a worn armchair. "Those stitches of yours are an affront to medicine, but they held. The wound is clean for now, but he's lost a lot of blood. He needs rest, food, and time. More time than I suspect you have." "What makes you say that?" Rosa asked, her voice tight. "A man like that," Alistair gestured towards the back room, "doesn't get a wound like that from falling off a horse. He has enemies, and a town like this, it thrives on gossip and speculation. You've brought a hawk into a chicken coop, young lady. People will notice." His words were prophetic. When Rosa left the doctor's house to secure a room at the town's only boarding house, a grim, drafty establishment run by a tight-lipped widow, she felt the weight of scrutiny from every shadow. Men watched her from the saloon porch, their conversations dropping to a low murmur as she passed. It was in the general store, while buying supplies and medicine, that the danger took a specific, chilling form. A man stood by the counter, a tall, gaunt figure in a long black coat. He had a predatory stillness about him, and his eyes, small and dark, missed absolutely nothing. He introduced himself as Bartholomew Finch, the town's self-appointed lawman, and Alistair's estranged brother. "That's a fine horse you've got," Bartholomew said, his voice a low drawl that didn't match the coldness in his eyes. He wasn't looking at Flint, who was tied outside. He was looking right at Rosa. "New in town?" "Just passing through," Rosa replied, keeping her answer short and her hand close to her belt. "With company, I hear," he continued, a thin, unpleasant smile touching his lips. "My brother is tending to your friend, an Indian. It's rare to see his kind this close to town, unless they're causing trouble or running from it." "He had an accident," Rosa said flatly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Accidents happen," Bartholomew conceded, picking up a tin of coffee and examining it as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "But that man, He looks like he's worth something. There are bounties on renegades these days. A healthy purse for anyone willing to do the paperwork. The threat was veiled, but unmistakable. He was sniffing around, smelling profit, and he didn't care where it came from. Rosa paid for her things, her jaw tight, and left the store, feeling Bartholomew's eyes on her back the entire way. She returned to the boarding house to find Kalen sitting up in the small, cot-like bed. The doctor's visit had helped. Some of the tension had left his face. He looked at her, his brow furrowed in a question. "Trouble," she said, unpacking the supplies. "A man named Bartholomew Finch. He thinks you're a renegade, thinks there's a bounty on your head." Kalen's expression hardened. He shook his head slowly, a deep frustration evident in the simple gesture. He wasn't a renegade. But what was he? Later that evening, as Rosa sat cleaning her rifle by the light of a single candle, Kalen used a piece of charcoal from the small stove to draw on a piece of packing paper she'd gotten from the store. His drawings were surprisingly deft and clear. He drew a crown, a symbol of leadership. He pointed to it, then to a figure of a man he drew next to it, an older man with a stern, noble bearing, a chief. Then he drew a smaller, younger figure beside the chief. He pointed to that figure, and then tapped his own chest. Rosa stared at the drawing, the pieces clicking into place with a terrifying certainty. The ambush, the relentless pursuit by Corbin, the inherent authority she had sensed in him even when he was near death. "You're the chief's son," she whispered, the words feeling heavy and dangerous in the small, quiet room. Kalen looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers, and nodded. The revelation landed like a physical blow. She hadn't just saved a wounded warrior. She had stumbled into a battle for succession, a dynastic struggle within one of the most powerful tribes in the entire territory. Kalen wasn't just a man, he was a political prize, a symbol of power. And a man like Bartholomew Finch wouldn't need to know the details. He would only need to know that this silent heir was valuable. Very valuable. Dead or alive. A sharp knock on the door made them both jump. Rosa grabbed her rifle. It was Dr. Alistair. His face was pale. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing Rosa a small bottle. "Laudanum, for the pain. But that's not why I'm here." He glanced nervously down the empty, dark hallway. "My brother, Bartholomew, he's been asking questions. He sent a rider out an hour ago, heading east, back towards the mountains." He looked at them, his kind eyes filled with a grim certainty. "He's not just sniffing around anymore, he's summoning the hounds." The fragile safety of Whispering Creek had evaporated. They hadn't found a sanctuary. They had stumbled straight into a trap. They were caught between the calculating greed of Bartholomew Finch and the murderous ambition of Corbin, who was now being led directly to their door. The air in the small room grew thick with unspoken urgency. Alistair's warning was a death knell for their brief respite. Bartholomew's rider meant that Corbin and his hunters would be upon them by morning, if not sooner. Whispering Creek was no longer a refuge. It was a cage, and the bars were closing in fast. "We have to leave. Tonight," Rosa said, her mind already racing, calculating escape routes, weighing their slim chances. Kalen was on his feet, his weakness forgotten in the sudden surge of adrenaline. He nodded his agreement, his hand resting on the hilt of the skinning knife she had given him. He was a warrior, backed into a corner, ready for his final stand. "You won't get far," Alistair cautioned, his voice low and grave. "Bartholomew will be watching. He's not a fool. He knows you'll try to run. He'll have the main road out of the valley covered." "We won't take the road," Rosa stated, pulling on her heavy coat. "There's an old miner's trail that cuts north through the rocks. It's treacherous, especially at night, but it'll bypass the valley entirely." It's your only chance, the doctor agreed. I'll do what I can to delay him. 'Cause a distraction at the saloon. It won't buy you much time, but it might be enough. He looked from Rosa's determined face to Kalen's resolute one. I don't know what this fight is about, but I've seen enough of my brother's brand of justice to know which side I'm on. Be careful. He's more dangerous than he looks. As Alistair left, a new sound drifted up from the street below. The boisterous noise of the saloon suddenly grew louder, punctuated by a crash of glass and angry shouts. The doctor was as good as his word. Now, Rosa ordered. They slipped out the back of the boarding house, moving like ghosts through the deep shadows of the alleyways. The town was a maze of sleeping buildings and dark corners. Every distant dog bark, every creak of a wind-blown shutter sent a jolt of fear through Rosa. They made it to the livery stable, the familiar smell of hay and horses, a small comfort in the tense night. While Rosa quickly saddled Flint, Kalen kept watch, his body tensed. But their luck had just run out. A lantern beam cut through the darkness, pinning them against the stable wall like trapped animals. Leaving so soon, Bartholomew Finch's voice slithered out of the night. He wasn't alone. Two burly men, local thugs he kept on his payroll, flanked him, both holding double-barreled shotguns. I'm afraid I can't let you do that. My correspondent hasn't arrived yet. Rosa slowly raised her hands, her mind calculating the odds. They were impossible. Her Winchester was on the horse, just out of reach. We're just passing through, Finch, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. We don't want any trouble. Oh, I think you do, Bartholomew sneered, stepping closer, the lantern light casting long, distorted shadows. His eyes were fixed on Kalen, gleaming with pure avarice. Your friend here is quite the prize. I received a message just this afternoon, a very generous offer from a man named Corbin for the return of a fugitive. It seems your friend is not just some stray, but a man of noble blood who has disappointed his family. He had been one step ahead of them the entire time. His rider hadn't been sent to summon Corbin, but to negotiate a price. He'd been selling them from the moment they rode into town. He's no fugitive, Rosa countered, stalling, her eyes darting towards her rifle. It doesn't matter what he is, Finch said with a dismissive wave of his pistol. It only matters what he's worth, and he's worth enough to set me up for life, far away from this god-forsaken pile of mud. He gestured with his pistol. Now, step away from the horse. My associates will escort your friend to a more secure location until our guest arrives. This was it, the moment where everything would be lost, the end of the line. But as the two thugs moved forward, Kalen did something unexpected. He let out a low, guttural cry, a sound of pure primal defiance, and charged. It was a suicidal move, but a brilliant one. He wasn't aiming for the men with the shotguns. He was aiming for Bartholomew. He crashed into the lanky lawmen, sending them both tumbling into a large pile of dry hay. The thugs, surprised, hesitated for a split second, unsure whether to shoot for fear of hitting their boss. That second was all Rosa needed. She dove for her rifle, yanking it from the scabbard as she hit the ground. She rolled and came up on one knee, the Winchester finding her shoulder as if it were an extension of her own arm. She didn't aim for the men. She aimed for the lantern one of them was holding. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil. The stable was plunged into absolute darkness, pierced only by shouts of confusion and rage. Burning oil spread instantly through the dry hay. "Flint, go!" Rosa screamed, slapping the horse's flank hard. The terrified animal bolted out the open stable door and into the street, a valuable, chaotic distraction. Flames began to lick up the wooden stalls, casting terrifying, dancing shadows. Smoke filled the air, acrid and choking. "Rosa!" Kalen's voice, raw and strained but clear, cut through the chaos. He had found his voice in the heat of battle. "Here!" she yelled back. He stumbled towards the sound of her voice, coughing. A shotgun blast tore through the darkness, splintering the wood of a stall right where Rosa had been standing a moment before. They were firing blind into the smoke and shadows. "This way!" She grabbed his arm, pulling him towards the back of the stable. She knew there was a small door there, used for pitching out manure. It was their only way out. They burst out of the back of the burning stable and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. Behind them, shouts turned to screams as the fire took hold, threatening to consume the entire structure. The town was waking up, doors slamming open, people yelling in alarm. The fire was Alistair's distraction, magnified 100-fold. They scrambled into the darkness at the edge of town, Rosa's internal compass guiding them towards the faint outline of the northern hills. They found Flint waiting nervously where she had trained him to go, a short distance from the chaos. Rosa hauled herself into the saddle, then reached down and pulled Kalen up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist for support. He was trembling, not from cold, but from the exertion and the raw fury of the fight. "Did you hear?" he rasped, his voice a painful croak, his mouth close to her ear as they urged Flint up the rocky path. "He called me a fugitive." "I heard," she said, her eyes fixed on the treacherous trail ahead, illuminated only by a sliver of moon. "He will pay for that insult," Kalen vowed, his voice gaining a sliver of the strength she had heard in his delirious ramblings. Corbin, Finch, all of them. Riding through the night, with the red glow of the burning stable lighting the sky behind them like a bloody sunrise, Rosa finally understood. The price on this man's head wasn't a bounty that could be paid in gold. It was a debt that would be settled in blood and fire. And whether she liked it or not, she was now part of the reckoning. They rode until the moon began to pale in the pre-dawn sky, pushing Flint to the absolute limits of his endurance. The miner's trail was a treacherous ribbon of rock and scree that clung to the mountainside. Below them, the valley containing Whispering Creek was a black void, the glow of the fire long since extinguished. Rosa finally called a halt in a small, sheltered bowl of rock where a trickle of meltwater ran over mossy stones. Flint stood with his head hung low, his sides heaving. Kalen slid from the horse's back, his legs nearly buckling. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a renewed, throbbing pain in his side. Rosa built a small, smokeless fire using dry sticks, shielding its meager light with their bodies. In the flickering glow, she looked at Kalen. The silence between them was different now. He had a voice, however broken, and a story that needed to be told. "My father," he began, his voice a rough whisper that scraped his throat, "is Chief Blackwood of the Stone Crows." The name landed with quiet force. The Stone Crows were not a small, scattered band. They were a powerful and fiercely independent nation whose territory stretched from the high plains to the peaks of the Grizzly's Tooth. They commanded respect, and often fear, from settlers and other tribes alike. Chief Blackwood was a legend, a stern but fair leader who had kept his people prosperous and free from the encroaching grasp of the government for decades. "Corbin is my cousin," Kalen continued, his eyes dark with a remembered betrayal. "My father's nephew. His ambition is a poison that has soured his heart. He sees the leadership not as a duty, but as a prize. He believes my father's peacekeeping ways are a weakness." He paused, taking a sip of water from Rosa's canteen. "My father is old. His health fails. He was to name me his successor at the Council of Elders during the next full moon. Corbin could not allow that. The ambush was now cast in a new, sinister light. It wasn't just murder. It was a coup d'etat. He arranged a hunting party, just the few men loyal to him. He spoke of a great elk he had tracked deep into the canyons. It was a lie. Kalen's hand went to his side, phantom pain flickering across his face. They cornered me. 4 of them. I fought, but they were prepared. Corbin, he watched. He watched as his man drove the spear into my side. He left me there. He told the others the rocks gave way, that I fell. A tragic accident. He came back to make sure you were dead, Rosa realized aloud. When he found you gone, he knew someone must have helped you. He cannot allow me to return, Kalen said, his voice gaining a hard, dangerous edge. If I reach my people and tell them the truth, his life is forfeit. He would rather start a war with the settlers, blaming them for my death, than face my father's justice. He will tell the tribe I was killed by white men and use their grief and rage to seize power. The full, crushing weight of their situation crashed down on Rosa. This was so much bigger than one woman and a wounded man. The fate of the entire territory rested on Kalen's survival. If Corbin succeeded, the fragile peace would shatter. Settlers, trappers, entire towns like Whispering Creek would be caught in the ensuing bloodshed. War would sweep through the mountains, consuming everyone and everything in its path. She looked at the man before her, no longer just a patient or a burden. He was the only thing standing between the future and a tide of unimaginable violence. The wooden hawk she had found on him, which he now wore openly around his neck, seemed to catch the firelight. "What is that?" she asked, pointing to the carving. "It is the mark of the heir," he explained, his fingers tracing its smooth shape. "Carved by my father from the heart of a lightning-struck pine. It is my name, my blood, my birthright. It is how my people will know me." For the first time, Rosa felt a sliver of true fear. Not the immediate fear of an ambush or a physical threat, but a deeper, colder dread. She was a solitary trapper who had wanted nothing more than to be left alone by the world. Now she was the guardian of a chief's heir, the protector of a nation's future, and a pawn in a deadly game whose rules she didn't understand. "My voice, it is weak," Kalen said, frustration clear in his tone. "But my strength returns. I must get back to our winter encampment. It lies 3 days' ride north at the foot of the Silent Sisters' peaks. I must stand before the council." "Corbin will be expecting that," Rosa countered, her practical mind taking over. "He and Finch will be hunting us. They'll cover every known trail between here and there." "Then we will take a path they do not know," Kalen said, a faint, grim smile touching his lips for the first time. He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a new, profound respect. "You know these mountains. You saved my life. You brought me through the storm. I believe you can guide me home." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith. He was placing his life and the future of his people squarely in her calloused hands. She looked at her rifle, at the endless expanse of jagged, snow-dusted peaks surrounding them, and at the determined, royal heir sitting across the fire from her. Her simple life of solitude was over. It had burned to the ground in a livery stable in Whispering Creek. She had a new purpose now, one she had never asked for, but one she could not, and would not, abandon. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "We'll rest for 1 hour, then we ride. But we won't be taking any trails. We'll make our own." For 2 brutal days, they followed a high-ridge ghost trail, a path that existed only in Rosa's memory, trading speed for stealth. The punishing ascent and the constant, gnawing tension forged a silent bond between them, a mutual respect born of shared hardship and grim determination. On the morning of the 3rd day, they stood on a high precipice overlooking the wide, sheltered basin where the Silent Sisters' peaks rose like twin granite sentinels. Below, nestled in a valley protected from the wind, was the smoke of many campfires. Kalen's home, Their relief was a fragile, fleeting thing. It shattered the moment they looked closer. Blocking the main pass that led down into the valley was a trap. Corbin's warriors, the ones loyal to his lie, stood alongside a grim posse of armed men led by Bartholomew Finch. They had joined forces, lying in wait to spring their final deadly trap. A direct approach was suicide. But Rosa's trapper's mind didn't see the trap. It saw the mountain. "The main pass is a choke point," she said, her gaze fixed on a crumbling goat trail far above the blockade. "And right above it, there's an overhang of loose rock and snow." She looked at Kalin. What if the prey became the hunter? Kalin saw her meaning at once. An avalanche, a force of nature as a weapon. It was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was their only one. They made the precarious climb, their muscles screaming in protest, positioning themselves directly above their unsuspecting enemies. Using the stock of her rifle and a heavy, sharp-edged rock, they chipped and pried away at the icy foundations holding the massive rock shelf in place. With a deep, stomach-lurching groan that seemed to come from the mountain's very core, the shelf began to fracture. "Now!" Rosa yelled. Throwing their combined weight against a massive, teetering boulder, they sent the world into a white, roaring fury. A tidal wave of snow, ice, and rock cascaded down the mountainside, pouring directly into the narrow pass. The scene below erupted into chaos as men and horses screamed and scattered. The avalanche crashed down, burying half the pass in tons of debris and splitting the party in two. Corbin and Finch, with only a handful of men, were cut off from the main body of warriors. Before the dust had even begun to settle, Kalin let out a piercing war cry, a sound of pure, righteous fury that echoed through the canyon. He launched himself down a steep scree slope, half sliding, half running towards his cousin. Rosa followed, her Winchester barking, her shots kicking up snow and ricocheting off rocks, forcing Finch's men to dive for cover. Kalin drew his long knife, his eyes locked only on one man. "Corbin!" he roared, his voice now full and powerful, the voice of a chief. The two cousins met in a brutal, desperate clash of steel and hatred. As they fought, Finch recovered from his shock and raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Rosa. "You've caused me enough trouble, woman," he snarled. A single shot rang out, but it wasn't from Finch's gun. The pistol flew from his hand as he cried out in pain, clutching a shattered wrist. On a nearby ridge, Dr. Alistair sat on a horse, a smoking rifle in his hands. He had followed them, his conscience finally overpowering his fear. The warriors on the other side of the rock's slide, having seen the mark of the Heir on Kalin's chest and heard his unmistakable cry, finally realized the truth of Corbin's betrayal. Cries of allegiance rose as they abandoned the usurper, scrambling over the treacherous avalanche debris to join their true heir. The fight was over quickly then. Kalin stood victorious, his blade at his cousin's throat, his honor restored. With Corbin and Finch captured by the now loyal warriors, Kalin walked over to Rosa. He stood before her, no longer a patient, but a leader returned to his people. "You have saved me," he said, his voice clear and strong for all to hear. "And you have saved my people from a war born of lies. The Stone Crows are in your debt." Rosa looked from the bustling tribal encampment to the quiet solitude of the high mountains. This was his world, not hers. "I was just repaying a debt of my own," she said softly, "to the woman I used to be." He understood. He knew she did not belong in the valley, that her spirit was as untamable as the peaks themselves. He reached up and took the hawk carving from his neck, pressing the smooth, warm wood into her hand. "A debt is a bond," Kalin said, "so that you will always know you have a friend among the Stone Crows, so that these mountains will always be your home. Go in peace, Rosamund Vance." She met his gaze one last time, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and mounted Flint. She rode, not towards the valley of men and politics, but back towards the high, lonely peaks that she called home. She had carried a dying warrior from the edge of death, and in saving him had found the last lost piece of herself. And so Rosamond Vance rode back into the frozen wilds, not as an exile running from her past, but as a legend in her own right. She had sought solitude, but found a destiny woven into the very fabric of the land itself. Her story became a whisper on the wind, a tale told around campfires of the brave woman who carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders and asked for nothing in return. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest acts of courage often happen far from the eyes of the world, in the heart of a single person choosing to do the right thing against impossible odds. If this story of grit, honor, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the harshest of landscapes resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a true tale of the West, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.